It is great to be here this morning. A little bit cooler this morning, but it is Michigan, right? This morning we are going to be in John chapter 18. And the title of this morning's encouragement is called A Different Kind of King. So in this passage, Jesus is standing before Pilate, and he's asked a very, very simple question. Are you a king? But we'll see that that question really isn't as simple as it sounds. Jesus doesn't answer it with a quick yes or no, because his kingdom isn't like the kingdoms of this world. So today we're going to see how Christ's kingdom isn't like the world, and we're going to focus on 6 different ways that it is not like the kingdoms of this world. First, its compatibility with earthly governments. Second, the character of its king. Third, its origin. Fourth, its rule over its people. And fifth, its purpose and its methods. And then sixth, its eternal nature. Then we'll see how Jesus defines his kingship in terms of truth and what that means for us today. We've kind of been dancing around these subjects this morning in the meditations as well as first hour. And then at the end, we'll come back to this central truth that Jesus is a king, but not the kind of king that the world expects, and his kingdom calls for our allegiance in a very, very different way than the kingdoms of this earth. Give you an illustration. Can you imagine trying to describe an ocean to a person who has only ever seen just a small pond? If you say, well, it's water, and you'd be right, it's true, it is water, but it doesn't capture the scale, the depth, or the power. So in the same way, when Pilate asked Jesus, are you a king? The word king is too small, too limited to fully describe who Jesus really is. So the first point, we'll see that Christ's kingdom is not like this world in its relationship to other earthly kingdoms, how they're different. When Jesus said in verse 36, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, he did not at all mean that his kingdom has no place here, but that it doesn't originate from, it doesn't depend on, or it doesn't act like earthly kingdoms. See, earthly governments, they compete with one another, they resist, and often clash with each other. But Christ's kingdom can exist under any form of government, underneath it. In the first century, Christians lived under the Roman Empire. They were sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted. Yet Paul could still say every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, in Romans 13, while at the same time declaring that we must obey God rather than men. So it's not a contradiction, it's just how they are different. Even today, a Christian in the United States, China, Middle East, can all share the very same king. That's something that no earthly kingdom can claim. Christ's rule crosses every border without conflict because his kingdom is not like this world. Then on to the second one, the second way that Christ's kingdom is not like this world, in the character of its king. See, earthly rulers, they'll often display their power, their wealth, their status, or force. But Jesus stood before Pilate without any of those things. He didn't have any of those. He had no army, he had no palace, no visible authority, yet he was the true king. And we see his character clearly in moments like earlier at the garden party when Peter struck the servant of the high priest. Jesus didn't command retaliation at that point. He healed the man. Now, what kind of earthly king would ever do that? A king of this world defends himself. They destroy their enemies, take pride in it. Yet he showed mercy to his enemies because he is not like this world. Isaiah described him as despised and forsaken of men, yet he himself carried our griefs. Not like most kings, is he? His authority isn't built on intimidation, but on righteousness, on humility, and on compassion. Then thirdly, Christ's kingdom is not like this world in its origin as well as its authority. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not from here." It didn't arise from any human ambition or any political movement that started. It comes from God. It originated from God. Earthly rulers, how do they gain power? They gain power through election, through inheritance, sometimes through force. But Jesus' authority was never in question. Never. See, even when Satan offered him all the kingdoms of this world in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus refused because his kingdom was not to be gained through compromise or through human means, because it's not like this world. His authority was already established by the Father, and after his resurrection, he declared that all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth in Matthew 28. His throne was not granted, it's inherent. It was his from the very beginning. And fourth, his kingdom is not like this world in the nature of its rule over its people. Earthly governments, they govern outward behavior. They can pass laws, they can enforce penalties, they can regulate actions, but they cannot change the heart. See, a law can forbid stealing, but it can't remove greed. Can't happen. Jesus goes deeper. He calls for a transformation of the inner man. Matthew 22 says, "You shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself." That kind of obedience cannot be forced on someone. It has to be from within. Consider Zacchaeus. No law required him to repay those that he had cheated. But after his encounter with Jesus, what did he say? He says, "If I have defrauded anyone, I give him back 4 times as much." The law could never force him to do that. See, that's the difference. Christ doesn't just command behavior, he changes hearts. And that's the behavior is what follows that, because his kingdom is not like this world. And then fifthly, Christ's kingdom isn't like this world in its aim and the means that it employs to accomplish that. What do earthly kingdoms want? They want power, they want security, they want control, and they often use pressure or fear or force to reach those goals. That's what they do. That's how they accomplish it. But Jesus makes it clear using a very common if-then statement. And he says it right there in verse 36. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting. We use if-then statements a lot. If this happens, then that would happen. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting. His kingdom doesn't advance through violence or coercion. It advances through truth. And that's what we'll be dealing with here. Even as in his interactions, we see this very clearly. You know, you remember the encounter with the young rich man. The rich man realized that there was something that he wasn't willing to give up. So it says that he walked away. Jesus didn't chase him down and force a decision. He let him go. He let him go. Because his kingdom is not like this world. It doesn't use the same tactics. And it's not a tactic, it's just the way his kingdom operates. Why? Because his kingdom grows through willing submission, not forced obedience. You can't force someone to do something from the heart. That's why the Great Commission is to teach and make disciples, not to go out and force people into the kingdom. This is an all-volunteer force. You don't get drafted in. Truth invites. It doesn't force. And then sixth way Christ's kingdom isn't like this world is its scope and its lastingness. Earthly kingdoms, they rise, they fall. The Roman Empire, standing in all its strength there before Jesus at this moment, eventually collapsed. But Christ's kingdom continues to grow. What began with a small group of disciples has spread throughout the entire world. Matthew 24, Jesus says, "The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come." Just like in every earthly system, the opposite of that is his kingdom will never end. Luke 1 says he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. Every earthly throne, someday it's going to be empty. Nobody's going to be sitting in that throne, but his never will be empty, because his kingdom is not like this world. So why is his kingdom not like this world? Because his kingdom doesn't run by force, it runs on truth. See, foundations matter. When you're going to build something and you want it to last, then the foundation is where you spend an enormous amount of energy. The foundation is what will establish something for a longer period of time. So now this leads directly into the second part of this passage here in John 18. Pilate responds, "So you're a king?" He's kind of taken aback a little bit. And Jesus answered in a way that defines his kingship. He says, "For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. See, here's the key. Jesus identifies his kingdom with the truth. This connects with what he says earlier, back in John 14:6. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus isn't just a teacher of truth. He was the physical embodiment of truth. He stood for truth. He was the truth. His kingdom advances wherever truth is received and believed. It also explains why his answer to Pilate could not be a simple yes or no. How could he answer yes or no to that question? If he had said yes, Pilate would have misunderstood him and perceived him as a political threat. And if he said no, he would be denying his own authority. So instead, Jesus lifts the conversation to a higher level, away from politics into truth. And this shows us something that's very important. See, the power of Christ's kingdom isn't found in force, it's found in truth that transforms hearts. When people hear his voice and recognize the truth, they willingly submit to him as king. Think of it this way. See, a tyrant forces obedience from the outside, but truth produces obedience from the inside. Jesus doesn't conquer by overpowering people, overwhelming them, but by revealing truth so clearly that hearts will respond to it. And this brings us to a very personal question. If Jesus is a king, then we've got to ask the question, are we a part of his kingdom? Not by nationality, not by background, not where you were born, but by whether we hear his voice and respond to his truth. So let's kind of step back and remember what we've seen here. We've seen that Christ's kingdom is not like the kingdoms of this world. We've seen that his power isn't through force, but it comes through truth. And we've seen that his authority comes from God. His rule reaches into people's hearts, to those that follow him. And we've seen that he calls people not by force, but to respond willingly to the truth. So then when we return to that scene before Pilate, we see a very glaring contrast in that scene right there. You got two people standing face to face. Pilate represents the power of this world, authority, government, control. He was the man in the moment there. And Jesus stands alone, outwardly powerless. You can tell by the scars on his back, the blood dripping. But in reality, it's Jesus who is standing there with the greater authority. Pilate, he governs temporarily, but Jesus governs eternally. And here is the thought. The kingdom of this world, they'll rise and they'll fall, but the kingdom of Christ still exists. It still stands. So when we step back to the scene, we can see it a little bit more clearly now. Jesus is the true king, but not the kind of king the world expects. His kingdom doesn't rise, doesn't fall with politics, with power, with position. It doesn't advance by force, by pressure, by control. His kingdom isn't like the world because it runs on truth. And that leaves each one of us with a decision to make. Will we measure him by the standards of this world? Or will we listen to his voice and receive the truth that he came to reveal to us? Because in the end, every earthly kingdom will pass away, but his kingdom will still be standing, and everyone who is of the truth will hear his voice and follow him. So think of two kinds of power here. One, like a storm. We've had storms lately, some of them pretty threatening. They're loud, they're forceful, pretty overwhelming. It can uproot trees, change the landscape just a little bit, but then it passes pretty quickly. The other is like the sunlight. Quiet, steady, persistent. It doesn't force its way in, but over time it brings life, growth, transformation. See, the kingdoms of this world, they operate like the storm. But Christ's kingdom is like the light. It doesn't dominate outwardly, but it transforms inwardly. It doesn't fade with time, but it endures forever. The question isn't whether Jesus is a king or not. I've already established that. The question is whether we belong to his kingdom. Because everyone who is of the truth hears his voice. So we have to recognize that there is a kingdom, invisible to the world, but more powerful, more lasting, better king, going to live forever, rule forever, not by force, not outwardly, but inwardly. That if we hear the truth and allow it to seep into our hearts, that it will grow and it will transform us into the image of his Son, and we will reign with him in his kingdom, which is not like this world. And that's okay. Let's stand and we'll be dismissed.